Here I am with my computer not working in a hostel in Hollywood, Los Angeles. Sort of, notes from the underground style, I suppose. Really, I'm in like a bunker. It's raining a lot, and it's like Hollywood Boulevard. There's tents everywhere. There was a car that crashed. It wouldn't stop beeping. There's people just sort of standing on the sidewalk, leaning against the railings, looking out into the traffic. It's all dark out. I don't know what's going on. But I promised myself I would do some more history content before my birthday. Tomorrow's my birthday. So this is the second video I did in this weird hostel. And I'm lying down. But here goes. I'm going to unravel the French Empire and Kingdom vis-a-vis the Holy Roman Empire, so that you can contextualize France's role sociopolitically throughout the centuries and understand what it was really sort of up to. I mean, in terms of its geopolitics, it was kind of a buffer state after between the Moors and the rest of Christendom that was in the Holy Roman Empire. And France, the Kingdom of France, did not always have the same amount of territory. After Charlemagne, Louis the Pious inherited all the Charlemagne's lands, Francia, right, West Francia, and then Charles the Bald inherited from Louis the Pious just West Francia, and he was responsible for instituting, cavalry doctrines into the standing armies of the time. So he really helped to specialize the French military, in the 800s, the 9th century, and he was stalwart. He was a bulwark against, the not the Eastern encroachment on his land, but eventually, I believe it was Charles the Fat would lose some of that land. The Charles the Bald tried to, permanently install in his domain. Both Charles the Bald and then later Charles the Fat were, had to deal with Viking invasions from the north, and the habit was they would just kind of go down the from the coast up down the Seine River to Paris, and they would basically try to attack Paris by river boat, from boats on the river, which is bewildering. And it usually didn't work, but occasionally, it was scary enough that occasionally it did work. Usually it didn't. And after a while, the Vikings invade, and particular French kings have to sign treaties and sign off land to the Vikings. And so Normandy, which is a huge swath of land north of France, north of Paris, northwest of Paris, near on the English Channel's border, or on the with the near the by the Channel Islands and all that, including the Channel Islands, and that whole area was kind of lost to the Viking installation there. Now they were Christianized; they had to speak French, so the Viking nobility in Normandy was watered down ethnically, but it did not really respect the King of France for some time, for most of its dynasty, and eventually it becomes arguably more powerful than the King of France in various ways, mostly territorially, militarily, and economically. But they invade England, but for whatever reason, it's considered like not appropriate to backstab feudal lord, so they don't. They go to England, they take over England, and then the lands of England sort of double. So you have England in the north, and then you have Western France in the south, and then Brittany on the west of that, and then which has stayed independent for a while, and then France with the the Duchy of Burgundy, and eventually they do reconsolidate during the Hundred Years' War, but it takes centuries. And so the Kingdom of France is not um, effectively uh, a power player, whereas the Holy Roman Empire to the east is a lot more organized, a lot more efficient. It's can control. It has nominative, and it has de facto and de jure control of plenty of places. Normative and positive control, a lot of territory, huge clump. And a lot of those places were French speaking. A lot of eastern France now was part of the Holy Roman Empire 1,000 years ago. It just was. And only even in recent centuries has it really started to be seen as French, or not Italian, or not German, or not Dutch. That used to be part of the Holy Roman Empire. Because the map back then looks so different from the maps now. It's a little bit like comparing, like, not just a human cell, an animal cell, to a bacterial cell, but it's more like comparing a human animal cell to a virus. The map looked totally different. And then one of the factors that proves this is that the Balkans was actually now the Balkans are splintered up into fragmentary polities that are kind of irrelevant, but back then the Balkans was clumps of massive kingdoms that had historically not been Christian, but they had recently Christianized and were very loyal to the Pope, or in the case of Bulgaria, and I think Serbia too, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Byzantine Emperor. But those clumps, which are mostly Kingdom of Croatia, Kingdom of Poland, Kingdom of Hungary, Kingdom of Serbia, and then the fifth one, the Kingdom of Bulgaria, which is kind of the most was the most outsized one. Hungary was really massive and important for centuries, until it got knocked down by the Ottomans, really. But the Poland was also really important, still is. Bulgaria was way more important than it was now. Romania basically didn't exist. The lands that are called Romanian, that is some sort of promise that they gave the indigenous people of Romania, because they're Latin, speak a Latin-based language. They gave them a country of Romania, I guess after the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell. I don't know. Maybe the Russian Federation just brought, the Iron Curtain brought it out. I don't remember that. But Romania didn't exist in the Middle Ages at all. It was all that land was either Bulgarian, or it was Hungarian, maybe Serbian, and probably not Croatian, but you get the drift. It was probably Bulgarian, Serbian, or up north, Hungarian. And control over the Black Sea was really a strategic issue, and the Crimea was probably as important then as it was now, as it is now. Obviously, the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire controlled the east, most of the southern part of the Black Sea, and it really buffered the Central Asian steppe people from Europe. It was a very defensive bulwark of a country. So the Byzantine Empire was more important than France. It was basically the way I think of it was the Holy Roman Empire had moved up from Rome, from the Mediterranean, to mostly German lands, but not all, but mostly. And then the Eastern Roman Empire didn't change that much. And actually, that's kind of what led it to be so conservative that it fell apart after centuries. just kind of dilapidated into nothing. Got taken over by, the Turks. But the Turks are, what a lot of people don't know is the Romans allied with the Turks when they were fighting the Persians. And the Turks, many centuries before the Mongols, controlled large swaths of Central Asia. And it was considered kind of like an empire all its own. So the Turks, they had a strong pedigree for the occupation and management of land, vast territories. It's not like they were, Johnny come latelys. They had been active players in the geopolitics of those regions for millennia. Probably not 2,000 years, but for about almost 1,000 years, they'd been active in some way or another by the time that they conquered Constantinople. Now, before these Byzantine lands are cut down to size, there's a lot of infighting between the Guelphs and Ghibelline factions in the Holy Roman Empire because they can't decide whether or not the people and the bishops can't decide that they should support the Pope or they should support the Holy Roman Empire. So there is a stagnancy in terms of expansion in the HRE because there's so much feuding over who really runs the show. But in France, like the Avignon papacy, Avignon was part of the Holy Roman Empire. Even though it's French, it was not part of the Kingdom of France. It was part of the Holy Roman Empire because it's Eastern France, southeastern. But what is now southeastern France. So when they move, that's a Ghibelline move. That's a Ghibelline stratagem move. It's not the Kingdom of France necessarily. It's a Ghibelline stratagem against the Guelphs who support the Pope to move the Pope. I could create an anti-Pope in Avignon. So it's all everything that a lot of the things that we think have to do with the Kingdom of France, the Valois dynasty, is more or less something that the HRE is implementing. Now, obviously, France is still a major factor in the Middle Ages. It's still a relatively large country, but it's just often seen as a quixotic buffer between the Moors and all the different parts of Europe to the east. And while I say a quixotic buffer, you're like, well, what about the Spanish kingdoms? Yeah, they were disunited at this time and had been for a long time, basically since the Visigothic kingdom fell, and it would take a while for them to unite. Take hundreds and hundreds of years for them to not just reconquer, but to unify into one the kingdom, Aragon, Castile. And it starts out, I think, with Leon. Is sort of the big player at first. There's Leon, Galicia, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and of course Portugal. And then before all that, there was the kingdom of Asturias, which is kind of the foundational Spanish Catholic kingdom. But these are small sort of kingdoms, regionalized, sort of in the backwater of Spain, I would say, and they're basically petty kingdoms, kind of like you'd find it in like Ireland or Scotland. They're not extraordinarily powerful on their own. They're basically a network of alliances that keeps the Moors at bay, who control so much land in different bodies, political bodies, but as a religion, they control so much land in southern Spain, central Spain. Barcelona is kind of the cool middleman between the Moors and France because it's on the coast. The Catalonia area is on the coast. So the Moors want to invade France, they have to go through Barcelona. So Barcelona is kind of the buffer for the buffer. And France is, everything ultimately is a buffer, but France was maybe not so much a buffer state, more like a filter state. If say Barcelona, the county of Barcelona, right, was a small buffer state, then France was more of like okay, well, now how do we get the ideology and the cultural biases and the technological differences, how do we make sure those don't get into the Holy Roman Empire? Now, this is no one's planning this, but organically, it just makes having France there makes it harder for those things to spread because France is very anti-Moor. At least that's what the record suggests. Might be wrong about that. Um, the public opinion in these centuries is always more complicated than we give it credit for. But I think France is a strong buffer state. Maybe more, you could qualify it as a filter state, right? But strong buffer state. England is not a buffer state. England is a small country that has expansive qualities, and but it's not a buffer state. Nor is Bohemia really. England's a little like Bohemia. It's a very central country in its region. It's not the kingdom of Bohemia and the kingdom of England at this time are not dominating the landscape of Europe, but in their regions they are the powerhouse. France is not even really the powerhouse in its own region, and that's what I keep trying to tell you. And it doesn't really become powerful until it wins the Hundred Years' War, and it basically doubles its over 116 years. It kind of doubles its land it has, and in doing so, it starts to challenge the Holy Roman Empire. It's like the little brother that grows up and starts to fight with its big brother. And Burgundy tries to do what Normandy did, and Burgundy tries to get the fuck out of France. Literally, like evacuation, like the ejector seat. It tries to evacuate from France, and it kind of does. But it creates a bloody mess, and centuries of warfare kind of ensue, a rivalry between the Bourbons and the Habsburgs, right? That kind of defines the political theater of Europe for most of its history. Central Europe, continental Europe, for so much of its history. Even England has to reckon with this all the time. So, and eventually, what really shakes it up even more is that immediately after France becomes strong, wins the Hundred Years' War and becomes strong enough to challenge. I say challenge. It's more like oppose. Strong enough to oppose the Holy Roman Empire. Spain also is rapidly reunifying in this period, and a little later on, but still close in the overall time scale, and still in the Renaissance, right? Like late Renaissance, late Middle Ages, early Baroque, right? So within 100 years or so, Spain kind of becomes its own powerful entity, just like France. France was not that strong, nor was Spain, and they both became very powerful in a span of like 250 years. And then what got even weirder is that for a while they weren't allies, but then about 250 years later they started being allies. And so you can see that this identity of sort of, not Italian but Romanized Catholic, you know, post-classical, whatever you call it, whatever academic terminology you might have to use, these Gallic sort of Iberian confederation, right, of tribes. Now it's turned into more of like a sort of like a Rome. Basically, what the HRE was doing by trying to be Rome outside of Rome, France and Spain start doing that, but they do it like 1,000 years after the HRE was founded, or 800 years after it was founded, and they do it in a extremely broad, globalized naval colonial context, where freighting is, spices and minerals is like sort of the name of the game. So when trade expands out into the Atlantic with the Columbian Exchange, France and Spain really buddy up and start to style themselves as the successors of the Roman Empire. But the reality is that, and obviously every other country that can be a colonial force does this too, but France and Spain do it in a way that is more comparable to the Holy Roman Empire, except The Holy Roman Empire never had to have all these colonies. It was just doing it because it was a land power base that had a very important defensive structure in the European geopolitics, even during the Roman Empire, the real Roman Empire. So France and Spain are playing hand in glove, trying to recapitulate the Roman Empire, but they're doing it in the New World or in Africa or Southeast Asia, and that's all well and good. But the problem is that every country that can build a navy or a shipping fleet is going to oppose them on some level, and so the whole world gets fucked up with these wars. They're basically just different white aristocrats vying for islands here and there, and resource mines and um, places that they can throw their slaves at to work farms. It's all just kind of bullshit. Now I say it's bullshit. I mean it's world consequential stuff, but it's so detached from the aristocrats' actual life. Like they're profiting off of these exchanges, but they're not really like seeing these changes happen before their eyes because it's all in some colony thousands of miles away that they would take weeks to get to. That's why it's bullshit, not because it doesn't matter. It matters. It's just the people who are responsible for it are more and more detached than they've ever been. And so that's me trying to explain why France has such a great reputation now. It's because it was a very good liaison for Europe to the rest of the world. As a colonizing nation, the French had a very diplomatic way of dealing with indigenous populations, and so indigenous populations around the world, if they had to choose a country they liked that was European, France is an easy go to because the French tended to be kinder. I'm not exactly even sure why. You could say it has to do with Catholicism, or you could say it has to do with just French culture, that pastoral tradition they had. I mean, the French people were kind of treated like servants or slaves anyway, because there's a wealth gap, right? An extreme one. And we all know it led to a revolution. So they toppled their fucking kingdom, right? So we know that, like, the French people were miserable peasants anyway. And so the French kind of treated, a new world subject is not extremely different in behind for with the French lens, whereas the English might view it slightly more like the English might view a New World subject as if they are an alien, and then the Spanish might view a New World subject as if they're like they just need to get like the paganism beat out of them over and over, like different attitudes depending on different cultural attributes of these European countries. And the French seem to be one of the most politically savvy ones. And that's why their diplomatic strength increased so much. Just because by comparison, they are slightly less abrasive to the indigenous than the Spanish or the English or Portuguese or the Dutch. And the Germans didn't have any colonies, really, to speak of. And then eventually they got a few of them, and they were very harsh. So Germany, despite being this amazing medieval powerhouse, as a colonial overlord or overseer, they were the most savage and most brutal. And the French kind of won that exchange. They may have been the whipping boy in the Middle Ages, but in the early modern age of sail, they were kind of the cool ones. They were kind of like the ones that everyone kind of wished they could be like a little bit, but couldn't afford to because they would lose so much money if they acted like the French weren't as successful, in the end because they were maybe a little too polite to the indigenous for their own good, but it does help their reputation. So yeah, that's all I can say. 25 minutes, and of course, the French were. I'll close it out with. I don't want to sound like a German supremacist because I think the French have a lot of great qualities as a people and a culture and a society, right? Very industrious society, amazing literature, great painting, great food. But I will say that the Romans conquered Gaul, conquered France under Caesar pretty early in their history, like at the end of the Republic, right before the Empire burst onto the scene. But they never really conquered Germany. Parts of Germany, sure, but like like the central like clump of what is now Germany, they never were able to conquer it because they I think the Teutonic Germanic tribes or whatever were pagan, sure, just like the Gauls, but so they had similar technology, but I think they were more ferocious as a war opponent, and they were never really vanquished. Now you could also blame that on poor leadership on the Romans. The Romans emperors got worse and worse over time, and it got harder for them to invade places that had really strong military traditions. But at the same time, they had some pretty later in the game. The Romans had some pretty strong emperors too. They had Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, uh, Marcus Aurelius, even, and he did actually fight in Austria or send legions out to Austria. So it's not like they weren't trying, but they couldn't really conquer that vast clump, that swath of land that is Germania. But they did. But France was like one of the first places they ever conquered, other than like all of Italy. They conquered. Then they conquered France. So I think they conquered France before they conquered Spain. That I should know that, and it troubles me that I don't. But I'm pretty sure they conquered France before they conquered Spain by like not that great, not that vast of a gap in time, but I think they did. And they conquered all the Mediterranean, but they just didn't. They couldn't go up north. They couldn't fight in the northern lands. They never conquered Poland. Um, Conquered only parts of Hungary, but they definitely didn't conquer Germany or Denmark or England. And they conquered England too. So they could conquer England and France, and England's pretty far north. But they tried it with Scotland and Ireland, but they couldn't. Ultimately, just England, and they couldn't get Germany. I think that tells you something about why the Germans were able to be so ambitious in restoring the Roman Empire. Because at the end of the day, they never really were subjugated, so they kind of felt like they could have it all. They could run the Roman Empire, and they kind of did. That's my argument, at least, is that they basically did for a time. Um, but France was never really the big deal in the power politics of Europe. I don't think it's ever really been. That's my hot take. I don't think it's ever really been the biggest deal in power politics. Maybe under Francois the First or Louis the Sun King or Napoleon for like 20-year spurts each. But like by and large, I don't know. Maybe I don't know. Prove me wrong. Write something in the comments. So almost at 30 minutes. I'll get up to 30 minutes just because better to do a half hour than 25 minutes, right? Um, so the French were easily conquered by the Romans, even though they had similar technological capability to Germans. The Germans weren't conquered, and I think the terrain was more conducive to guerrilla tactics, for the Bronze Age or whatever. And the early Iron Age, and they were better at. Like they didn't even have swords, Most of them had like some spears, maybe some axes. They didn't even have swords. Like they were very backwards technologically, but they still were able to repel the Romans because their legions couldn't resupply, and they'd get ambushed in the forests and stuff, in the mountain passes. But France was such a flat land by comparison that the flatter landscape was a lot easier to trample over or whatever. Um, and Spain wasn't entirely different. It was just hotter. But I don't think the Italians are too concerned about heat. Uh, Not like that. I don't know what to say. The Napoleon's a but Napoleon is what people like to point to when they're like France was. It may not have been super strong in the Middle Ages, but eventually it became very strong. And Napoleon's like the best example. But Napoleon, he carried this revolutionary spirit on his shoulders because he was a product of the French Revolution. His successes were he fought in the Revolutionary Army, but he was not, and he did expand. Like eventually, the French colonies in Africa were like took up like half of Africa or almost, but that was in the industrial age with the where they were working hand in glove with the British, and they kind of decided, and the French and the British allied way later in history in time, like way down the pike in like the late 1800s. They start allying with the British, taking over lands and dividing Africa. But I think that's largely because Britain's navy was so strong, and Britain's navy is what kind of wiped out Napoleon, at least in terms of him being able to resupply his ports, and keep France going, with its failing economy during his plundering and stuff. So Napoleon kind of was vanquished, obviously vanquished at Waterloo, famously, but even before then, at the Battle of the Nations, he was vanquished. He was vanquished twice, and he was sent to two different islands, and it's kind of embarrassing at the end, but still an incredible spirit. And it wouldn't be for a while that the after Napoleon fell, basically the French became like subservient to the British in terms of diplomacy and international relations and stuff, and they kind of were became like the cultural arm for the English. Like the English were industrial powerhouse, and the French couldn't be as industrial because it would rip up all the pretty buildings they had built in the 1700s, right? So, with their decadent king, right, he built all these nice palaces. They couldn't just rip it up, so they decided to embrace architecture and culture, and then some industry, and obviously they had a bunch of colonial money too. And then they became like sort of the whipping boy for England up until the World Wars, and then and that kind of fucked them over in World War One, and that's why they lost to the Germans, because they had been kissing up to the English for like 100 years and not really winning, not really developing their military tradition past Napoleon. I mean, they did slowly, but it was like paled in comparison to what the Prussians were doing, right? And so I just tried to dispel this myth that like France is like the center of Europe, or the most elegant, important, and illustrious country in all of Western Europe. It's really like the Midwest of Europe, if you think about it. Maybe the Texas, or I don't know, maybe the Ohio, depending on context. Maybe the Illinois, right? I mean, that's a French name, Illinois, right? So I'll leave you with that. Maybe I should just keep going for an hour. I don't really know. At some point, it's gonna be harder to upload the videos. Uh, Sort of an embarrassing way to do these videos, but it's like I don't have a lot of other options. And so I want to do another video where I talk about Hungary and Bulgaria and these large kingdoms in the Balkans and also in Eastern Europe, and explain why the other side of the Holy Roman Empire never really unified and became strong. Because I think that they were actually very strong, but they had more land than the French. The French, at the end of the day, I can criticize them all I want, but they just didn't even have that much land to work with. They had that, that's like a square of land that's limited by sea. They have too much. They have a lot of coastline, and of course England and other places can develop a navy too. They're not the only ones who can develop a navy, so they're limited by land, and they're easy to invade because they have bridges from Spain and Germany. But on the other side of that German area, you have a large corridor of land going all the way down to Greece, from Greece all the way up to basically Finland. But that whole area, the mountain ranges, sort of like in the Carpathian Basin, the mountain ranges in Hungary kind of cut off, marches, northward marches. So and then like there's just tons of random mountains in the Balkans and in Macedonia and places, Serbia, like that the topography is not like that easy to navigate. You can do it, but it's somewhat treacherous, right? Whereas Germany is a fairly like well defended, like flood plain, right? In the north, and in the south, it's like a big clump of mountains, the Alps, and then sort of the hills sloping eastward. So like Germany is a more like the land just sort of culminates into the Alps. It's getting higher and higher and higher until you get to the highest mountain range in Europe. It's not that alpine land really gives them natural fortification where they want it. But the natural fortifications from the mountains in the Balkans and up in the Baltic area, those are like kind of confusing even in those regions. They don't really help the regions. They help them from outside invasion, but they don't help with unity between people in those regions. And so that's why those regions aren't as unified. Well, you can go up to Poland, of course, and there are places that have more of a floodplain, but um, Poland is also a place that's like France, really easy to sort of invade. So Poland's probably the most similar country to France of all those. Maybe Hungary too, but I would say Hungary or Poland. Although I've been looking more and more at more at Bulgaria, because back then Bulgaria was way bigger and it was a rival to the Byzantine Empire. It's almost as large as the Byzantine Empire. It was a massive, massive empire. They call it the Empire of Bulgaria. They had their own patriarch, I think, and they were trying to be the Byzantine Empire of the North. It's actually a really amazing historical subject, and they had these fierce rivalries and wars with the Byzantines over who could lead Greek Orthodoxy. Of course, the Byzantines are actually Greek, and the Bulgarians weren't, but they still wanted to lead the charge of Orthodox Christianity. So really fascinating stuff. Lots of infighting in that corridor, that longitudinal zone. I guess longitudinal zone or range or whatever. But France is a different story. France is like a pivot point in Europe. You just kind of have Europe, and then it goes and pivots down towards Spain, and there's an island up here, and that's kind of menacing. And France is not really in a great place in terms of, um, you know, uh, avoiding invasion. However, historically, they have won a lot of battles in defense of their homeland. The people of France are very good at defending their homeland, that's why they have never really been conquered, except by let's be honest, the Nazis conquered them, but that's like the only time in um like their whole entire history. After it was basically Caesar and Hans Guderian or whatever, the Battle of the Ardennes Forest, right? And so France was Vichy France. By the way, a lot of those French people just sold out their Jews and stuff. They weren't they were already allied with the Nazis before they were even invaded. It's actually a really sad story. So don't cry a bunch of tears for France, because the French kind of wanted to be invaded to some extent. They were pretty anti-Semitic before World War One or World War Two. They just didn't have the military to do anything about it. They really were kind of fucked up. It's not even a joke. But anyway, so the French, they were very good. Well, I guess the positive thing I'm trying to say about them is that they were really, really quite good at fighting pitched battles all throughout the centuries, defending their homeland from invasion, because they did get invaded on occasion, and it seemed like a task that anyone could kind of pull off. But the French are fearsome. It's not like they let anyone conquer them. The irony is they let the fucking Nazis conquer them, which is like the worst possible people to get conquered by. But still, they for about 2,000 years, they didn't. No one was able to conquer them. So that's a pretty good record. All right, 40 minutes. That's cool. I wonder what I'll talk about next. I'm thinking I'll do something with Spain, or maybe the Viking North, because no one really talks accurately about sort of Norse history. It's often the subject of abuse from streaming TV shows on the web. All right, that's 40 minutes. That's the best I can do. Ta for now. I'll have to read more books and articles to say more. And if you have any questions, I'm sure I can answer them. It's not like I'm totally tapped out, but just write in the comments. I'd love to see what people are thinking about in regard to the sociopolitics of historical Europe. Ta-ta for now. I don't know why I keep doing that. I need a better slogan or gesture. I don't know. I just don't. I need my own gesture. Probably when I have a better video quality and less hair. Peace. Good night and good luck.